Welcome back, everybody, to our studies in political philosophy. In this lesson, what we're going to be doing is talking about the foundations of liberalism. So, previously, we took a basic introduction to liberalism, we took a basic introduction to the origins of liberalism, highlighting the point that when we think about liberalism, the first point that we often go to is, of course, the Enlightenment, the ideas of the Enlightenment. And that's because, of course, liberalism is heavily influenced by, and then in return, heavily influences the Enlightenment and Enlightenment ideas, such as what we see here on the screen, the image of the founding fathers and the Declaration of Independence and the creation of the US Constitution, in addition to, of course, revolutions in France. But we also made it clear that the Reformation and the ways in which we see a shift away from communal religious undertakings in Catholicism actually shifts towards this idea of an individualistic understanding of religion within Protestantism. And of course, we then look at practical inventions that really accelerates this idea of individualistic idea of individualism within religion, with things like the printing press. This lesson is going to speak more about the specific elements of liberalism itself, talking about the foundations of liberalism. And within the foundations of liberalism, we're going to be talking essentially about the core ideas of liberalism, focusing on the relationship between liberalism and the concept of human nature, the ways in which a liberal conceives of the person and conceives of the self, and the lens through which this, in fact, attracts to liberal ideas. Because fundamentally, a lot of people, when they study political philosophy, or at least when they begin their studies in political philosophy, seem to get it into their heads that what they are talking about when they think about political philosophy is the ways in which the state works, or the idea of democracy, or the concept of economic justice, or the concept of political justice. And these are all obviously very important ideas within political philosophy, let's not get that twisted. But what's also important is the ways in which people think, the ways in which people view the world, and how they ought to view the world. If you want to think about this in a bit more detail, we did a lesson on the sort of foundations of political philosophy previously. And the way human nature is viewed through the lens of political ideologies informs the ways in which political ideologies essentially ascribe what may or may not be moral or immoral, or what may or may not ought to take place within a political system. Which then, of course, downstream from that, we again get the idea of actual policy. So we have the sort of the conceptual, quite metaphysical understanding of human nature, which then informs our understanding about what ought and ought not to be the case in relation to society, what the state ought to do, what the state should not do, how the state should be organized, how the state should be ran, whether or not there should even be a state or not. And then from there, we go then to the pragmatic policy. We look at actually what is the difference between, for example, a proportional representation system versus a non-proportional system in voting and democracy? What about economic policy? What about taxation? So all of these things derive back from these quite grandiose metaphysical, meta-ethical conceptualizations of human nature, which is why we're going to begin here by looking at human nature and the ways in which liberalism takes this view. So, fundamentally, the general view of liberalism is that we see quite a lot of reflection and quite a lot of connection, shall we say, and association with the views of the Enlightenment. And so this general view of liberalism, closely reflecting and associating with the Enlightenment, informs our basic principles of the early liberals, the people like John Locke, the people like philosophers such as John Stuart Mill. And one can understand the liberal lens through which human nature is viewed by looking at the distinctions between human nature in the medieval period, in the sort of the traditions of medieval philosophy, and the way human nature is viewed and understood in the Enlightenment. The medieval concepts of and the sort of early Middle Ages and the late Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, understands human nature to be one that is strongly tied to religious doctrines, specifically Christian doctrines, such as doctrines of original sin. You cannot detach from political philosophy, at least these early areas of political philosophy. You cannot detach political philosophy from religion. You cannot do that. You have to think about religion, and you have to think about the ways in which Christianity and Christian doctrines actually informs these Western ideals of political philosophy, in order to get a really good understanding of how political philosophy developed in this way. The traditional Christian understanding of mankind and of human nature is that we are deeply flawed and that we are deeply imperfect. If you want to know more about that, see our lesson on original sin and from the perspective of St. Augustine in our medieval philosophy lectures. To overcome this, we have to think about the praying for grace of God, something that was also an Augustinian concept, an Augustinian doctrine. But we see that this is something that can be quite considerably contrasted with the ideas that we find in Lockean political philosophy, in the political philosophy of John Locke. John Locke instead takes a liberal view of human nature. The idea that human beings have the capacity to bring about progress, and that this entails further reward, further opportunity, further happiness. In addition to this understanding of liberalism, we can also get an understanding of rationality. Okay, the liberal, at least from this classical perspective, asserts that human beings are essentially and they are inherently rational creatures. It is this rationalism that allows humans to find solutions to a number of very important and deeply philosophical questions. So, for example, liberalism believes that mankind's innate reason is manifested in debate and discussion and a logical extension of ideas and rationalization, fundamentally. It is this idea of rationalism that gives the liberal view the ability to allow human nature to shape our own destiny. You can then tie and link this and connect this to ideas related to predeterminism and to free will and to the extent to which determinism is a better understanding of our metaphysical conceptions of free will and free rational choice. And then finally, we have this very interesting conceptualization, one that the classical liberals definitely adhere to in terms of their understandings of human nature, but that is less adhered to as time goes on when we start looking at some more modern and more up-to-date political philosophies when it comes to liberalism. Generally speaking, liberals see that individuals are naturally self-seeking and naturally self-serving. This is an idea that we call egotistical individualism. There's a certain amount of egotistical nature in relation to the human self, and it is individualistic in the sense that they are self-seeking and self-serving. Egotistical individualism is essentially the view that human beings are naturally drawn to the advancement of their own interests, and when this is the case, and connecting this with the idea of reasonability and rationality, the idea of egotisticalism and rationality, we get conclusions which essentially allow us to see the advancement of our own interests as human beings, but that are also, it is also an understanding of classical liberals that people and that humans are sensitive to the perspectives and the ideas and the needs of their peers. And so from this view of human nature, not necessarily incorrect or not necessarily correct in any meaningful sense, the point of these lessons, the point of doing political philosophy and to teach political philosophy is not to come to a conclusion of who is correct and who is not, whether you should be a liberal or a conservative or an anarchist or whatever. The point here is to think about the ways in which liberals view, classical liberals view human nature, and how this actually informs their interests in a bit more detail. But you can see here from the fact that people are naturally egotistically individual, but they are also sensitive to the perspectives of their peers. And we can see from here how we can get this understanding of human nature and how this can feed into and tie into the basic liberal positions that relate to how a liberal sees the state, the economy, society, all of these different questions that we will explore in future lessons' time.